4 disturbing true hitchhiking horror stories. Story 1: The Silent Hitchhiker. It was a chilly autumn evening when Sarah decided to hitchhike home from her college campus. She was running low on cash and thought a quick ride from a kind stranger would be harmless. She stood by the roadside, thumb out, watching as cars zoomed past. After about 15 minutes, a beat-up old sedan pulled over. The driver, a middle-aged man with a scruffy beard and a worn-out baseball cap, leaned over and asked her where she was headed. Sarah hesitated for a moment but then decided it would be fine. She told him her destination and hopped into the passenger seat. The man introduced himself as Tom and seemed friendly enough, chatting about the weather and his love for classic rock. As they drove, Sarah noticed a strange silence settling in. The man had stopped talking and was staring straight ahead, his knuckles white on the steering wheel.
Trying to break the silence, Sarah asked him about his family. Tom glanced at her, his eyes cold and distant, and said in a monotone voice, "I don't have a family anymore." The way he said it sent a shiver down her spine. She tried to laugh it off and change the subject, but Tom remained silent.
Minutes felt like hours as they drove in silence. Sarah's unease grew when she noticed they were heading in the wrong direction. She pointed it out, but Tom didn't respond. Panic set in as he continued to ignore her and drove deeper into the countryside, away from any familiar landmarks. Desperation took over. Sarah tried to open the door, but it was locked. She begged Tom to let her out, but he kept driving, his expression blank and emotionless. Finally, they reached a desolate, wooded area. Tom stopped the car, turned off the engine, and looked at her with a chilling smile. "I need to show you something," he said, his voice eerily calm. He got out of the car and walked around to her side, opening the door. Sarah knew she had to make a run for it. She kicked him in the shin and bolted out of the car, sprinting into the woods. She could hear Tom cursing and stumbling behind her, but she didn't look back. She ran until her legs gave out and hid behind a tree, trying to catch her breath. The silence of the forest was deafening, and she strained to hear any signs of Tom. After what felt like hours, she finally heard the sound of a car engine starting and driving away. Shaken and terrified, Sarah waited until dawn to find her way back to the main road. She eventually flagged down another car, this time driven by an elderly couple who took her to the nearest police station. She reported the incident, but the authorities never found Tom or his car. The experience left her traumatized, and she never hitchhiked again. Story 2: The Mysterious Van. Jake was an adventurous spirit who loved to travel. He often hitchhiked across the country, meeting new people and experiencing different places. One summer, while traveling through the Midwest, he found himself stranded on a lonely stretch of highway. The sun was setting, and he needed a ride to the nearest town. After an hour of waiting, a white van pulled over. The driver, a woman in her early 40s, smiled warmly and offered him a lift. Relieved, Jake climbed in and noticed the van was meticulously clean, almost too clean. The woman introduced herself as Karen and chatted pleasantly as they drove. As night fell, Jake began to feel uneasy. Karen's cheerful demeanor seemed forced, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He glanced into the back of the van and saw a row of neatly arranged tools and cleaning supplies. It looked like a mobile workshop, which struck him as odd. Curiosity got the better of him, and he asked Karen about the supplies. She laughed lightly and said she was a freelance cleaner taking odd jobs wherever she traveled. Jake nodded, but his gut told him something wasn't right. The van had no signs or logos, and the tools didn't seem like the kind a cleaner would use. They drove for hours with no sign of any town or rest stop. Jake's unease turned to fear when Karen took an unexpected turn onto a dirt road leading into a dense forest. He asked her where they were going, but she ignored him, her friendly facade replaced by a cold, determined expression. The van stopped in a clearing and Karen turned to him, her smile now menacing. "We're here," she said cryptically. Jake's heart pounded as he tried to open the door, but it was locked. Karen got out and walked around to his side, pulling out a large wrench from the back. Desperation took over, and Jake managed to unlock the door from the inside and burst out of the van. He sprinted into the forest, hearing Karen's footsteps behind him. He ran blindly through the trees, branches scratching his face and arms, until he stumbled upon a dirt path. Following the path, he eventually found a small cabin with lights on. He pounded on the door, and an elderly man answered. Out of breath and terrified, Jake explained what happened. The man took him in and called the police. They searched the area but found no sign of Karen or her van. Jake's encounter with the mysterious van haunted him for years. He never found out who Karen really was or what her intentions were, but he knew he had narrowly escaped something sinister. The experience made him wary of hitchhiking, and he vowed never to take a ride from a stranger again. Story 3: The Desert Nightmare. Emily and her best friend Lisa were on a road trip across the Southwest. The vast desert landscapes were beautiful but also isolated. One afternoon, their car broke down in the middle of nowhere, miles away from the nearest town. With no cell service and little water, they decided to hitchhike to get help. After hours of waiting under the scorching sun, a rusty old pickup truck pulled over. The driver, a grizzled man in his 60s with a weathered face and cold eyes, offered them a ride. Desperate, they accepted and climbed into the back of the truck. The man, who introduced himself as Hank, was silent as they drove. The truck rattled over the rough desert road, and Emily felt a growing sense of dread. She noticed a shotgun and a box of ammunition on the floor of the cab, making her even more uneasy. They drove for hours with no sign of civilization. Emily tried to make small talk, but Hank's responses were curt and unfriendly. As night fell, the temperature dropped, and the desert became eerily quiet. Emily and Lisa huddled together for warmth, praying they would reach a town soon.
Suddenly, Hank veered off the road and stopped the truck near an abandoned shack. He turned to them with a sinister smile and said, "This is where you get out." Emily and Lisa exchanged terrified glances but obeyed, hoping to avoid any confrontation.
As they got out, Hank grabbed the shotgun and pointed it at them. "Start walking," he ordered, his voice cold and menacing. They had no choice but to comply, their hearts pounding in fear. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, and they had no idea where they were. They walked for what felt like hours, Hank's truck following slowly behind them. Exhausted and dehydrated, they stumbled over the rough terrain. Just when they thought they couldn't go any further, they saw headlights approaching in the distance. A car pulled up and a middle-aged couple got out. Seeing the girls' distress and Hank's threatening stance, they called the police and offered the girls a ride. Hank sped off into the night, leaving them behind. The couple took Emily and Lisa to the nearest town, where they reported the incident to the authorities. The police searched for Hank but never found him. Emily and Lisa were grateful to be alive but deeply traumatized by their desert nightmare. They continued their road trip, but the experience left them wary of strangers and the dangers lurking in the vast, empty landscapes. Story 4: The Friendly Stranger. Tom was a college student hitchhiking home for the holidays. He had done it before without any issues and considered himself a seasoned hitchhiker. One cold December evening, he stood by the highway hoping to catch a ride before it got too dark. After about half an hour, a black SUV pulled over. The driver, a well-dressed man in his 40s, greeted Tom with a warm smile and offered him a ride. Grateful, Tom accepted and got into the passenger seat. The man introduced himself as Peter and seemed genuinely friendly, asking Tom about his studies and plans for the holidays. As they drove, Peter's demeanor remained pleasant, and Tom felt at ease. However, as night fell, Peter's questions became more personal and invasive. He asked about Tom's family, his relationships, and even his financial situation. Tom felt uncomfortable but didn't want to seem rude, so he answered politely. After a while, Peter suggested they take a shortcut through a wooded area to avoid traffic. Tom hesitated but agreed, trusting Peter's judgment. As they drove deeper into the forest, Tom noticed the road becoming narrower and more isolated. His unease grew, but he tried to stay calm. Suddenly, Peter pulled over and turned off the engine. He looked at Tom with an unsettling smile and said, "We need to talk." Tom's heart raced as Peter's friendly facade melted away, revealing a cold and calculating demeanor. Peter reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a knife, holding it menacingly.
Tom's survival instincts kicked in. He lunged for the door handle, but Peter grabbed his arm, pulling him back. They struggled, the knife glinting in the dim light. In a desperate move, Tom managed to kick Peter in the chest, causing him to drop the knife. Tom seized the opportunity, grabbed the knife, and fled from the car.
He ran through the forest, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the sound of Peter's footsteps behind him. The trees seemed to close in around him, but he didn't stop, driven by pure adrenaline. After what felt like an eternity, he stumbled upon a small cabin with lights on. He pounded on the door, and a woman answered, her eyes widening at the sight of him. Tom explained his situation, and she let him in, locking the door behind them. They called the police, who arrived shortly after and apprehended Peter.
Tom's encounter with the friendly stranger left him shaken and wary of hitchhiking. He realized how close he had come to becoming another statistic, another missing person in the news. The experience haunted him, a chilling reminder of the dangers lurking behind a friendly smile.